list, so we have the gentleman you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
the company he works for,
Subordinate.
subordinate, the customer for the company, which is in sub-bullet, which is the government,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps some management, and the president for the company perhaps is involved. All right. So what did you see were the ethical considerations?
At least going down this list, most of them we thought were at least somehow considered in this, minus like the race one and religion and whatever. At least we thought Supercom was violating possibly three, because they didn't know beforehand that the test was as effective as the other one, so they were like stating that the technology was working even though they really didn't know if the test was as effective or not. They were also violating number 6, 9, 10, 4, and 1.
Can you summarize those without numbers? You don't need to
Okay,
give me a
well,
paragraph.
you have the sheet.
I don't.
Oh, okay. 6 was they maintain improved technical competence. They have qualified training and experience.
So you imply they don't have, if they did know the test was good enough to begin with, then they were both in violation by doing a substandard test and
Yeah.
actually not properly trained to be doing the working to begin with.
And then number 9 was they're avoiding injury to others, property, reputation, and employment by false malicious actions. Well, they're doing a falsified test, so there's that. 10 is assist colleagues and co-work in their professional development and support them in following the code of ethics. Supercom was definitely not doing that. They're not even abiding by the contract that they had set out with the U.S. government. Reject bribery in all forms with number 4. Said that they were trying to get a less costly and shorter test, even though it's not what they set out to do. And then number 1 was welfare of the public. Since this is for the military, they don't know if the test is effective or not, so it could be a safety hazard to the public.
Or more broadly defined, welfare of the public. They're taking the public's money.
That too.
Therefore, they're in the trust of the public, so they should do what they said they're going to do, regardless of safety or anything.
Yeah.
So then, if those are the ethical concerns for those people, what did you think should happen next?
I mean, what Ralph went ahead and did, trying to get the contract changed, we thought that was a pretty good idea. We think that Supercom should have considered that if he presented it logically with, all the facts and figures that he had about the effectiveness test. I mean, there's no reason for them to not make the contract change.
All right. And so alternative scenario, obviously, carry it one step further. And if they say no?
And if they say no, then, they could get sued by the U.S. government. They could lose this contract in general.
Under what conditions would they get sued? It sounds like from your description, if I'm interpreting it correctly, so I've actually read it, but I'm going to go off of what you've given to everyone else.
Okay.
Is, from what I've heard, Ralph's done a test, or has been doing a test, but he has the knowledge and he knows that it's a substandard test, although it's as good, right? It's just not what they contracted to do.
Yeah.
So there's various ethical violations involved with the company. But who knows? Ralph, and who else? His subordinate?
Yeah.
And at the end, what does he do? He goes to the company.
Yeah.
All right. So, in what situation is anyone involved in litigation here, or actual consequences for ethical violation? So far, anyone?
The company, maybe, but they might fire Ralph for pointing it out.
All right. So one possible outcome of what happened is Ralph could get fired. Right. Best case scenario was what happens?
They changed the contract.
They changed the contract. So they actually go back, they admit that they were in violation of their contract, but it's okay, we realize it's okay, right? And the government says that's fine, we got too much paperwork to do anyway, we'll let you rewrite the contract. and then all's forgiven, right? Now what about Ralph then, in the other situation? He goes and they say no. What should he do? Put yourself in his position. So he goes to his company and says, we should renegotiate the contract. They say, What do you think will happen?
Try to contact a lawyer maybe, so, because it is concerned maybe to the public. Probably somebody knows.
I'm confused, is the procedure in the contract the correct one, or is the one that they're doing the correct one?
Let them answer.
The one-
Because they seem different, and you want to change the
Well,
contract to the one that they're doing?
The one that they want to do is how it's stated in the contract, but apparently the one that they're actually doing is less costly, quicker, but it's just not what they're saying.
There's one in the contract that was the correct test that they're supposed to be doing, but they're not doing that because it's not as cost effective or short as this other test.
But it says they're both equally effective. It's
Just one's in the contract, one's not. So one's not, before Ralph got there, evaluated to be how effective it is.
Yeah, I will interject that I've learned something in the last 6 months of in my own professional career, is that contracts are very different than grants. And as a scientist, I'm bound by what's called a grant, which gives me a lot of freedom to do things that I think are necessary to do. So for instance, in this case, if I was presented with this, I would be actually valid after the fact of going back and saying, I did something that was cheaper, but it's just as effective. Okay? Because I'm bound by what's called a grant. Contracts, or actually like, you have to follow them verbatim as they are written. So companies, and if I'm a scientist working for a company, I would be bound by a contract. It would be very different, is I have to do what the contract says. If I don't, then I have to do what Ralph has asked them to do, which is to renegotiate, or I'm in violation of my contract. I'll give you an example. I go to a workshop recently. I got up and presented my data. I showed a slide with some data points on it and said, I did this. Okay? The people who were on contract got up and said, we were contracted to do 32 experiments. Here are our 32 data points. Okay? They were very specific about what they did. Okay? So it's very different, the contract versus the grant. Okay. So you think Ralph should do what he did,
Yeah,
and you think the company should agree?
I think they should agree. If they say no, I'm not really sure. Like, because he knows it's not really affecting the public terribly because it's as effective. So
Mhm.
if it's,
So he could just divest himself of it, or he could go to a lawyer or something,
yeah,
right? He should proceed cautiously, right? He's done that. He's gone to his management and said, you should renegotiate.
at least for it's his no loss because he's already retired.
Okay.
So I guess he could proceed a little bit more, forcefully. If he really wanted to.
Getting retired, I'm sure all this is pretty stressful. You could just stay retired and go find a house in Hawaii or something.
It probably wouldn't be ethical, but he could.
Relax.
Yeah, you're actually getting close to I think the case actually. Anyone else have? I mean, it goes beyond Ralph and the company, right? You've got the government involved. There's a subordinate. Did they play a role at all?
I mean, the subordinate could try to go and persuade the company as well.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like he would have less say than Ralph did, so if they rejected Ralph, then...
So Ralph has previous knowledge of it.
Right. The one thing that is common between academia, research labs, whether they're non-profit or profit, and companies that are under contracts is there's a chain of command. So as soon as something happens, it goes all the way up the chain of command, so, including all the way out to the people that you're contracted with. So there are ethical implications all the way up the chain.
One other comment you already brought out, just emphasizing this. If it turned out that the test they were actually doing, which was cheaper, wasn't as effective, it'd be, I think, a lot more obvious what you should do. But when it turns out that the cheaper test actually is just as effective. It's easy to say, well, it's just as effective, there's no loss, there's no danger to the public, because I know that this test is cheaper and shorter, and it's just as effective. And it's just easy to say, so it's no big deal. But like he says, the contract says you do it this way. And you can't just decide, I'm gonna do it a different way, even if it's as effective. Even if it were more effective, you know, you could get in trouble.
You have to ask for permission.
Right, right.
Actually, I actually am under funding contracts. So I just happened to me yesterday. So I tried to take some money that was for someone else's salary and use it because the university here didn't need it to buy a piece of equipment to do an experiment because the money was going to go unused. But it turned out I actually had to go to the Army, who's giving me the money, and ask for their permission to open a category called equipment and move the money from one place to another. So in that sense, for when there's money involved, there's always contracts. Any feedback from the peanut gallery? You want to see what really happened? This one's a real one. So you can see what really happened. So they didn't accept his request, as we thought they might not, and it goes up to the top of the chain. So the president didn't want to let on that he was actually doing the wrong test. He didn't want to confess that he was being unethical. So Ralph did what you thought he might do, which is he quit. He went back into retirement because he didn't want to be involved in anything illegal, right? But what he also did not do is he didn't turn in the company, okay? But the other guy did. Someone else did. I don't know that it's exactly the subordinate, but someone did. They waited 3 years, but someone turned the company in and said, we're not following our contract. And then Ralph got a phone call, which was he had to actually testify in an investigation. And then I think you see what happens next.
And he, as it says in the solution, which we'll give you out copies, he cooperated without question.
He actually violated his own NDA,
Right.
which stands for non-disclosure agreement. So he actually went ahead and cooperated with the federal government and gave them information, even though he had originally signed an agreement that he would not. He's like, I don't want to be involved in anything bad. And he went ahead and told them everything he had known from before, when he had retired and divested. Turns out, Ralph got charged anyway. He was complicit in fraud because he knew that they were actually violating their contract, right? There was an ethics, there was a professional violation there. He eventually was acquitted, as were most people in the case. So it seems like he got off, except, right? This retired guy went through a lot of stress. It actually cost him a lot of money, legal fees. He had to defend himself, right? He was retired. It wasn't like the company supported him or anything, right? They didn't pay his legal fees. Supercom, right, ended up paying over $1 million in various fees, and actually now, it's not called Supercom, whatever the name of the company actually is. No longer allowed to do government contracts.
And an $800,000 fine.
Yeah, so over $1 million when you add up the legal fees plus the fines. So all because the president didn't want to renegotiate the contract, right? Whereas it would have been much easier for them to proceed, you hope, and actually ask for permission and say, can we renegotiate this contract? It turns out that we've been doing this. So this is a good example of, it gets complicated. It affected Ralph, even though he thought he was out of it. To quote The Godfather, they pulled him back in, right? And so it cost him some money. As far as I know, it didn't cost him like personal stuff like his, wife or life or anything, right? But I think this was from IEEE, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is from the engineering discipline. So it could cost you money. All right. So who has? I didn't number mine.